Hi, I'm Kate Still. I head up the farming team for the Soil Association charity, so within our farming and land use team. And we're here today to talk about outwintering and extending the grazing period through different trial work that we've been doing with our Innovative Farmers programme. Before I sort of introduce that, the idea today will be that we have our lovely speakers. So I'm just going to give you a little brief introduction and a few words on one of the trials that I'm leading on. And then we've got our lovely farmers who are going to talk about the work that they're doing. And then we'll do questions at the end, if that's okay. So if you can all start thinking about, as you're listening, all of the great things that you would like to ask, and then we'll be able to do questions at the end. So outwintering is being given more and more consideration by farmers as they're trying to focus on reducing costs associated with housing over winter, and also considering all of the additional benefits that it can bring from animal welfare points of view, so providing a much more enriched and interesting environment outside if they're being outwintered, if you can obviously get the shelter and protection right, but also very much from a soil health point of view, if you can get the numbers right and moving them around sufficiently, it can have additional soil health benefits. And we get building up more and more evidence of that, of different practices that you can do associated with outwintering that can have soil health benefits. But from a cost point of view, obviously reducing the costs associated with bedding, with machinery, with any kind of additional bought-in feeds that you may be having to use. There's a lot of added benefits from being able to have your stock outside or winter. So more farmers trialling different things. So yeah, through Innovative Farmers, which is our farmer-led trials program, which basically enables farmers to be in the driving seat of answering the questions, solving the problems that they've identified on their farm. So through field labs, which is what we call them, is essentially getting farmers together so that they have access to researchers, they have access to a pot of money, they have a facilitator to just help coordinate them and get them all together. And so they're able to think about the things that they want to, the questions that they have, the problems that they want to solve, and set up trials to try and do that in a, timely and efficient way, but with the scientific rigor that they would like in order to be confident with the answers that they're getting. So through different trials that we've have going on, we've been able to look at all of these different options for outwintering. If you have any trials, or if there's anything that you want to investigate on your own farms, then do please talk to us afterwards, as we're looking for new trialists at the moment, particularly new groups of farmers who have questions that they want to answer. Either come and talk to me and my colleague Laura afterwards, or come to the Soil Association tent, and there's lots of opportunities to get access to researchers and funding and all of those things. But a key thing with Innovative Farmers is that it enables us to get the results out to people as quickly as possible. One of the challenges with academic research through research institutes is that it can take a very long time post the trials being completed for then those scientific papers to be written up, for that to be then translated into whatever means that is then more accessible to a wider audience. But with Innovative Farmers, we really focus on getting the information out there as much as possible, having events, doing things through our newsletter and through social media and all that sort of thing, so that people can get those bits of learning quickly as soon as they're out on farm. And one of the trials that I've been working on, I don't know, you may have come to our session last year, was focusing on, I think it was drought-resistant swards, or something to do with extended grazing, focused on extended grazing. Anyway, Dan Gammon was one of our trialists, and he was speaking because we've got this basically leaving a longer rotation within the dairy grazing. So it's not mob grazing, but basically looking for a kind of optimal grazing rotation where you're really focusing on not just getting good nutrition for the cows, but then you're enabling you to have the root mass that you want from a longer sward, and enable some trampling to increase that soil organic matter, get the soil health improvements as well. So Dan and Tom Gregory and a couple of Matts and some other guys down in Dorset and Devon are trialling with some of their dairy herds, looking at this extended rotation on a couple of trial fields. And one thing I just wanted to point out before I pass on to all of these lovely people is this was on Dan's trial field and on his control field that we dug some pits last year, is that you can see, I don't know if you can see that well, but certainly on the left side, which is the trial field where we've got a much longer cover, a much taller cover, you've got a much greater root mass than on the control field that he's grazing on a normal 21-day rotation. And the mob side is more like 35-day rotation. And so that root mass that you're getting is enabling like a more resilient sward, so it's working better in periods of low rainfall. But then thinking about going into this overwintering phase, it's meaning that he can keep the cows out longer because it's able to tolerate the cows out there for longer, and also is growing more grass, so he's got more grass to feed them. So it's not directly associated with outwintering, but it's just quite interesting that maybe going for this taller grass approach is enabling a more resilient sward that is going to cope better with the cows being out longer, as well as obviously through the dry period. Right, anyway, let's crack on. So in terms of the three speakers we've got today, we're going to be focusing on bale grazing and also multi-species winter forage crops. And we're going to have, I will just briefly introduce the three of them, and then they can say more for themselves. We've got Claire Beaumont. She farms with her husband, and they've got traditional beef shorthorn cattle on a farm up in Cumbria, with most of their land being severely disadvantaged and SDA moorland. A few years ago, they chose to start practicing regenerative farming and adding value to their produce by selling direct, and have been overwintering all of their stock, except in exceptional circumstances, using a combination of deferred grazing in wood pasture, bale grazing, and kind of electric fence rotational grazing. And she's going to tell us all about that. And then we have Emily, and Emily Grant's an independent consultant and facilitator with her business Forage, specialising in helping sheep and beef producers develop resilient pasture-based farming systems, working both one-to-one and with farmer groups. And Emily's been doing some work for ADAS on the trial, HDB, on the trial that Claire has been involved in, looking at the economic impact of bale grazing, and she's going to share some of the results of that with us, so that's brilliant. And then we have Tom Armitage, and he runs around 270 stabiliser suckler cows, finishing or his prodigy. He farms down in Somerset, farming 545 hectares of organic upland, and is using herbal leys and red clover, arable silage, permanent pasture, mixture of diverse winter mixes for outwintering. And he's going to tell us specifically, or particularly, about some of the trials that they've been doing, looking at these brassica mixes for outwintering. So we're going to hear from all three, and then we'll do some questions at the end. Brilliant. Go over to you, Emily.
Thank you. So yeah, as Katie said, I farm with my husband and my parents in the Lake District. We're by Ullswater. We are Pasture for Life certified, and we're going through organic conversion, but we've been operating organic for about 5 years now. So our main aim for our grazing strategy is to have. So we have a suckler herd, but we finish everything ourselves. So we sell meat direct, but we also sell breeding cattle. So and the aim is to have those breeding cattle as hardy as possible. So we are sort of supplying other farms with very hardy cattle that can survive out winter or survive outside just on grass. While we're talking about outwintering, I kind of have to talk about it through our overall grazing strategy across the whole year, because you can't just decide in October I'm going to outwinter. You need to have a plan in place. So this is our farm. We are, for those who know the Lake District, the body of water at the bottom there is Ullswater. So we start all the way from the fell. The top fell is where we actually graze ponies during the summer, and it's got nothing on the winter because that's in a higher tier moorland option. for most of the year, we are mob grazing our cattle along that 160 acres of meadows. So from April through to November, we're doing mob grazing, which means that in the whole of the growing season, we have got that area of wood pasture and woodland effectively just growing for winter. So that is our main area of outwintering, is that big block of deferred grazing. We have a couple of pigs and followers that are there throughout the year, but they don't have a huge impact, to be honest. We'll see. So we are in possibly the wettest part of the country and on heavy clay. So if anyone tells me that they can't outwinter because it's too wet and their ground is too clay, I won't agree with you. So this is the rest of our presentation is just nice pictures of the farm. We've got on the top left, the big aerial photo is just looking at the winter area in summer, but just from the other angle. The other photo was taken from the fell that's just the other side of the lake. You can see at the bottom there is just how much grass we have. It is up to my knees before we put the cattle in. And just having that amount of forage just means that we don't get poaching, because that is often what people say is, oh, it'll poach up the ground, but it doesn't, because we've got loads of grass. With the area we have also, we've put into wood pasture, some of its creation, some of its restoration. So we've got sort of a lot of these cages now where we put in a lot of trees. So the top photo was taken before we did all that planting. But essentially, we've just got a lot of grass, and that keeps us going through to March. And even when it snows, we don't feed any hay. I think that's quite key, is that it's tempting, as soon as it snows, it's tempting to get the hay out, but you don't need to. If you've got good, strong native grasses, they are sticking up over the snow, and as soon as you start feeding hay, the cows, they stop foraging. They kind of start expecting you to turn up with more hay on the next day, but you just sort of get into a cycle. So this photo is to show that sometimes it's better up on the wood pasture than it is. Well, our house is down at the bottom of the valley. It was horrible that day. We couldn't see anything. We were just in fog. So this is one of our cows, and I'll sort of get onto cows and weaning, but this was the first year we trialled not weaning some calves and kept them on their mothers. Because the aim is, particularly for the heifers, we want them to stick with their mothers, because the mothers can teach them to forage in that winter area, so they can choose what they need at particularly harsh times of the year. So in that area I mentioned, we've also got ponies. Ponies are great because they eat the rough stuff the cows don't want. Because we effectively set stock in that area, we're worried about certain species kind of dominating that the cows don't really like. So the ponies eat gorse, they eat millennia, they'll eat thistles. I've seen them eat thistle from flower right down to digging up the root. So they're really for kind of conservation grazing purposes. And then we have pigs, because pigs are also brilliant. The pigs, we don't feed the pigs either. The only time we ever buy-in feed for the pigs is when they're farrowing, because we have to restrict where they're going. The rest of the time they're out foraging. And in the snow they build these little nests, which was pretty revelationary. I've seen I think about 4 or 5 of them in a nest like this, and they just sort of jumped out still steaming. So we have those. They're kind of like our ecosystem engineers. They just go and mix stuff up, and we've got area of bracken, which they kind of sometimes even choose to just sort of dig up, and so they're there to kind of control a little bit of our bracken and create a bit of opportunity for things to seed in. So I'm kind of here because of the bale grazing. So I thought I'd better talk about that. We did some tests with our forage, and because at the end of February the cows were starting to complain to us. If anyone's got cows, if they're hungry and they're not happy, they will tell you about it. So we could see that there was still plenty for them to eat. But we were kind of thinking, what do we do? So we did some forage analysis on an area that was ungrazed throughout winter to see what was going on. And we found that right up through till February, the quality of the grass was really good. It had really high protein. But then in March, it massively dropped off. It was still better than hay, to be honest, because we were doing the test of our hay at the same time. But we did realise that something needs to happen in March. So we bring them down off the wood pasture, and we do a month of bale grazing. This is the only time the cows get hay. So we have a 12-acre field. This is the field that's part of the field lab. This was, I think, so this year we had 43 head of cattle, 54 4-foot round bales, which were a mixture of our own, but we'd also bought in some species-rich bales from a local Cumbria Wildlife Trust. We'd rested it for 6 months, which is quite key because it meant that there was still a lot of thatch on the ground, because you do find it's a lot of cattle in one field for a month. It's going to take a bit of hammering, but so you kind of need that thatch to support the soil. We're in second year, so we've done 2 years now of grazing this field. But then by the end of March, which is when we finish the bale grazing, that's when we start our rotations, because we kind of need them we need to hold them back from the lower fields, just so that there's a bit of growth before we start the rotations, because we find that if we had started it in March, you're sort of stopping it from growing, because you need to have some grass in front of you before you start rotating. So I haven't mentioned the bulls. We have, because obviously we're out wintering, you need everything out, but if our bulls, if they had half a chance, they would get into the rest of the cows. We do limit when, we do have a very short bulling period. So we have our bull, we keep some entire, we sell as breeding bulls, and then this year we had a few bullocks that we weaned just to sort of take a bit of pressure off the bale grazing. So we have an area, the map on the right, the photo on the right, that has basically, there are 2 fields. We use our topography. We've got a sort of ridge line and a woodland that keeps them separate. But that area keeps them happy for most of the year, to be honest. Most of the winter anyway. We sort of rotate them between 2 fields. They don't get any hay. Either it's sort of really low stocking rate between them, and certainly this year, the first beef box that we're actually doing on Monday was from one of the bullocks. So we have an older bullock with our bull as well. We call him our bull's mate. He's usually the fattest, the first to be fat. So throughout the winter, having no hay is fat by, it was probably fat by early June, to be honest. And then I haven't mentioned wean calves. So we used to wean our calves. We don't anymore because we've culled out essentially the cows that were struggling over winter with their calves on them. But we did previously, and all we did with the weaned calves is we had them really lightly grazing out, mob grazing the lower fields, and scattering some hay for them. And because whenever we come out of the mob grazed paddocks, we never graze it right down to the last tiny bit of it, centimetres of grass. We always leave some behind. So that was keeping a sort of small number of weaned calves happy. So I know that I'm handing over to Emily with the financials, the bale grazing, but she's kind of got swept in numbers from everyone, but I thought I'd tell you ours specifically. We did used to house back in 2018, 2019 winter. We didn't like it, which was why we kind of were focused on going to outwintering, but we didn't want to house because it's just a real tie. We no longer have a herd. We don't have a shed that's big enough for our herd. So these numbers are slightly skewed because our herd's got bigger and bigger. But yeah, as you can see, there's an awful lot less costs. I mean, most of the costs associated with those fully outwintered is our time, and that's it. There is no other cost, essentially. I mean, we bought in some bales, but yeah, so the rest of the other cost is the contracting cost to make our hay. But often I do say that the real key to outwintering is that I've now got a shed that I can do some other stuff in. So yeah, it's quite handy. But yeah, I think I'll pass over. Do I pass over to Emily to talk?
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, yeah, we'll hold on for questions. But yeah, thank you very much to Claire. Emily, you take on.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Claire. That's kind of a great introduction to what I get the joy, depends how you see these things, of doing the technical stuff. So yeah, I don't have nice pictures of cows, unfortunately, but yeah, here comes some graphs and some charts if you're into that kind of thing, which I normally am. So we were asked, so this kind of sits as a bit of a bolt-on to the Pasture for Life Innovative Farmers Bale Grazing Lab, and we were asked by AHDB just to look at some of the economics of bale grazing, and basically to undertake an economic evaluation of the farms that are in the project to compare bale grazing as an alternative to winter housing. Okay, so there's obviously a wider field lab, as Claire alluded to, and Kate, that it's looking at, the wider stuff is about the impact of bale grazing on forage quality and soil health. So this is really just trying to pin down some of the economic stuff. So the farms involved were the 6 that are involved in the Pasture for Life bale grazing, plus I've helped out with the facilitation of the AHDB Northumberland monitor farm for beef and lamb, who we'd probably at similar timescales had got him to change his system from fully out in wintering 220 suckler cows, gradually moving them into outwinter. So we can touch on some of these. Just really quickly going through the different farms, there's 7 farms in total. They are located between Aberdeenshire is furthest north, Oxfordshire furthest south, and I put in Penrith, not just as furthest west, but as Claire alluded to, I think you're the wettest within there. So there's a bit of a range within there. Also, more variables here. The farm size vary from 44 hectares to 1,141 hectares. Herd size varies from 14 breeding females to just under 220 breeding females. And everybody's, it's classic, isn't it? We all know all farm systems are really different, and we always aim to try and find the commonality between them. But I just want to really highlight all these differences. But yeah, offspring sales can be, they are a mixture of store or fat, but 4 of the 7 farms are actually selling direct to their consumers. The number of days that people had on bale grazing varied from 34 days up to 180 days. So some are actually bale grazing for pretty well most of the winter. And actually, I would say most people do what Claire does, in that spend a good portion of the first half of the winter just on deferred grass. And it's not until we move into the later part of the season before they introduce into bale grazing as we go through. And actually, a real challenge for us, I did this with a colleague, Ridian Jones. One of the real challenges is that all but one of the farms had actually been undergoing quite major structural changes, with some of them still building cow numbers. There was one as well who used to have a sheep beef system, but had sold all the sheep, and now has a deer enterprise on there. Some had just converted to organic. And this is really slightly my caveat for it's really, really hard then when we have such variation in different farms, that we can really sort of pin down some really useful numbers, and particularly when farms undergo quite big structural changes, because we don't actually necessarily then have a clear before and after with similar number of head. But we did have that, we'll come on to that. One in particular we did have, and it's actually the monitor farm in Northumberland, where they still have just about 220 head of suckler cows, which were previously in-wintered in a house system to this outwintering. So how did they do it? And this is part of the way we kind of structured the report, is just as well, we'll try and find some of the commonalities that might be useful. And doing this kind of task is a little bit like, I don't know if any of the farmers here undertake benchmarking when you compare peer to peer. really what benchmarking, it's really difficult. And if you have done it, you know how hard it is to really think, well, okay, they've got really low cost of production there. How do they do it? And benchmarking with peers really, and I feel the same about this, it really shows you what's possible. But actually what's probable is slightly different on your farm, because you have your own cost structure, you have your own resource base, etc. Anyway, so all of the participants use permanent pasture sites. And the soil type varied from sandy loam, so pretty free draining, quite nice position to be in if you want to outwinter, and going through to, as Claire suggested, going into heavy clay within it. So range of soil types. Only one participant cut hay in the same field, this is Claire, who cut hay in the same field that they actually bale grazed. Everyone else was actually cutting hay on different fields and then moving it into the bale grazing field as they'd made that. 3 of the participants also purchased in the hay, but most of the reason for that purchased hay was actually to introduce wildflower species. So it was a specific aim to increase diversity of pasture to go and purchase that hay in, rather than being reliant on homemade. Maximum mob size was 80 head. And maximum number of mobs that any one farm was bale grazing with was 4. So this is obviously one of the bigger units that were running 4 mobs with decent size number. All the participants unrolled their bales. So there's a range of ways you can offer the bales, and some people have used ring feeders or just leave them in situ. But I think everybody, or those who have tried it, find that actually generally unrolling works a little bit better. It's a little bit easier for all the cattle to have access to that hay, and actually it's slightly better to spread the nutrient load rather than having these kind of hot spots. The average bale wastage, because that's always a common question as well, it's like how much of the bale do you lose, is came through about 10.8%. Most people, the range of that was 5% up to 25%, but I would say the one who said 25%, it was a specific aim to leave a fair amount of organic matter out of that hay bale within it. I think everyone else was just really, the 5 to 10% was really just what the losses are, the natural weathering and the natural little bit of trampling losses within that. And of course, when you say wastage, it's still supplying something to the system, but when you view it economically in terms of you effectively whether or not you're buying in or making, there's still a cost to making that hay, and you need to factor that in if you're not getting full utilisation. Although to be honest, I would say 5% loss is still pretty good, even if you were considering that on a kind of conventional utilisation system. I'm not sure how well this will show up. They're probably not big enough screens, but again, talking about the variation, everybody had pretty different times that they were deferring the pasture that they were going to bale graze in, and also how long they were bale grazing for. So I suppose the key differences here are, you can see the kind of olive colour part of the bar, and that's 4 different farms, is the period that they actually deferred the pasture for. So the one, Farm B, obviously had the longest period, and then, which is actually you, Claire, as well. So, and as we said, because Claire obviously said she only had a short period that you actually bale graze for. And then you can see kind of Farm A and Farm F had much shorter deferred period. And Farm F in particular was bale grazing for quite a long time. And you can see those areas as well. Farm F, that was 90 hectares put aside for bale grazing. And then the other differences are just, the kind of rest period, i.e. the time between the final graze on the bales in winter and when they next come back in to graze. So everybody still did at least one graze within that summertime, just to kind of almost sort of reset pastures before shutting off again and putting the bales out. And there's a little, probably won't be able to see where there's a little line hanging down off most of them, of just the time that they set out bales, and mostly that was just within a week or two of actually shutting the pasture off for winter. So again, as I said, just a real range and how people are utilising their pastures and what their aims and objectives are for it. So I'll just briefly, because it probably looks like a lot of data on there for you, but basically how much hay and how much deferred grass were people providing within that daily diet. The average was that on a dry matter basis, it was 58% of the daily intake was coming from grass and 42% from hay. The highest and lowest was 63% coming from grass and 37% coming from hay. So the decisions on that just are really variable. And when you work it out on a metabolizable energy basis, it actually wasn't sitting too dissimilarly. And importantly, as Claire said, the quality of the grass and the hay is really different. And it's not uncommon for people to say, as Claire did, that you quite often find that deferred grass really does start to lose its quality as the winter goes on. It'll stand pretty well for a good portion of that winter. And I know we've just had probably one of our wettest winters ever, which doesn't help. But the average ME of the deferred grass, not everybody had analysis for us, but we just picked up where we did. It was 9.1 ME and 13.2% crude protein. And when you look at the hay, again, as Claire had alluded to, that the ME is a little bit less on average at 8 and only 10.5 crude protein. But you can see when we're doing that roughly 60-40 or roughly 50-50, we actually have a really nice balanced diet for a suckler cow. It's absolutely perfect, providing more than enough nutrition for a suckler cow. I think where it would become challenging, not that anybody was specifically doing this, but for growing and absolutely wouldn't be supplying enough ME for finishing stock over that time period that they're actually on that diet. The potential benefits, I mean, pretty well consistently, what were the kind of cost savings? And also, actually, I'm going to touch on, because the benefits sometimes we can't quantify financially, and these will appear in the end of my list. But so we did have an additional question to say, well, what are the wider benefits that we can't pick up when we're talking about finances? But pretty consistently, reduction in fuel. Yeah, it's pretty obvious that if you're not starting the tractor, and particularly the bigger farms had mixer wagons as well, if you're not starting that every day, and instead you're running out to some deferred grass on a buggy and just rolling a couple of bales of hay out and shifting one electric wire, you're burning significantly less fuel. So one farm in particular, where we got some really good detail of his before and after, he's using 72% less fuel when the cattle are on that bale grazing system rather than when they're in the house. Labour and time, it varied according to each farm, so it also varied with the number of mobs. So obviously, the fewer mobs you have, the less time you're spending going around moving them. But on average, there was a 50% reduction in labour time on the bale grazing versus the in-wintering. Again, another big saving, and particularly because straw prices, straw's pretty expensive already at the moment. But for to the bigger farms, they were buying in, both actually made some of their own straw. They also had some arable, but were buying in. So they were saving between 20 and 30,000 pounds per annum by, now, okay, these are bigger farms, so that sounds a lot when we talk about these, kind of feels like big numbers, but they were still, not insignificant savings by not having to purchase straw. And actually, just to a point, that straw was used for both bedding and to balance silage diets, so they were also feeding some of that straw as they go through. And again, potential benefits is increase in pasture fertility. We've not put any costings on that. That's obviously part of the wider Pasture for Life Innovative Farmers project. So it'll be good to get actual, because otherwise we're just guessing at roughly what kind of fertility. And also it's really important to note that, and a lot of the work that's been done in Canada and North America is you will obviously, depends on your starting point of pasture fertility. So if you've got low fertility pastures that you want to improve fertility on, then obviously bale grazing is a really great way to go and get that fertility up. If your actually starting point is that you've got what, if you see an analysis, would be seen to be pretty good fertility, and you've got real free draining soils, you maybe just need to be mindful that you're not actually losing some of those nutrients if you're going through wet period or just flushing through the system. But that's kind of thing, we'll work through. To be honest, most of these were working from low-level fertility pastures already. And the stuff we can't put a value on, but is hugely important to people. Number one, well-being. It's so important, and common comments were just A, prefer being outside rather than being in a shed, and B, just buying more time. And one farmer in particular who basically would finish lambing and calving, spend the next couple of weeks mucking out sheds, spreading muck, then making silage, and then come August starting to cart straw all the way back in. And he got rid of a lot of those tasks over the summer. Plus, it's not taking him long to go and bale graze them, so he has a really good work-life balance now, which he's loving. Potential costs, but there's a potential loss in your summer or autumn grazing area. And certainly one of the farms we worked with, or the one we got most figures for, had a slight reduction in sheep numbers to allow that period of time that they weren't grazing in that summer autumn time, because obviously they need to shut it off rather than just put stock in the shed. Potentially linked to that, a potential reduction in stock numbers or output. Now that might work really well for your system, but I think everybody, if you're considering this, you really need to have a good grasp on your figures and where your output needs to be in order to be, because one of the really hard things for us to get rid of in our systems is actually fixed costs. And particularly because other than Claire, actually, they've repurposed their shed. And this is what was mentioned too down, is something called stranded costs, where if you've got a shed that's sat empty, you still are incurring costs around that shed, whether it's repairs, maintenance, or insurance. And actually, if you're not utilising it, those costs are still being incurred. So you just need to be really careful about deciding, how can you make this fit the system while still being able to cover those fixed costs as going through. So that's a bit of a warning, is don't reduce output too much if you can't generate enough cash in the system. It's where we all want to get to in cost reduction, basically, is the perfect sweet spot is that you maintain output, but you can reduce costs within it. And that's kind of like the sweet spot of where we all want to be. The slight risk of pasture, reducing pasture fertility in other parts of the farm if you're exporting hay elsewhere. Not an issue at the moment, but it's maybe something to be concerned or to consider if you're consistently taking nutrients from, for example, in-by hay fields and then putting it up onto higher land up above, and just making sure that that's all balanced within there as well. Because normally what would happen in wintering is you would make hay silage, feed it inside, then spread the muck back on the hay silage field. Bale wastage, as I said, is not necessarily wastage because you're still providing the soil something, but don't forget you've actually incurred a cost to make that bale. And if that's not converting into kilos of live weight, then actually, that needs to be balanced by the benefit that you're getting from it. Okay, so the way we did this was just really like a partial budget. 1 minute. It's pretty well me. And we basically looked at, 70 head housed with silage. This was a typical wintering system. Silage, straw, pot ale syrup, plus mucking out, plus spreading the manure, versus the bale grazing. And the numbers on the left were really how much did it cost him per head per day in wintering. And it was costing him £3.23. Under the bale grazing system, per head per day. Under the bale grazing, it was £1.63 per head per day. So he's basically halved his wintering costs the time that they are on the bale grazing. And I think that's probably roughly where, as a guidance of what cost savings can it give you, then I think we're pretty well there on that. And just the other stuff, much happier, having more family time, etc. Feels more like 9-to-5 job than a tie. Weekends are now weekends, etc. And the biodiversity benefits as well. Just seeing a lot more insects, birds, etc. within that. And cows being fitter at calving. And that should be me, yeah.
Thanks very much. Just in terms of the, sorry, I should know this, but obviously you were doing the economic analysis, but of that Innovative Farmers Field Lab for the actual bale grazing or the soil analysis, we've got another year?
I think we've got more. It's 5 years in total.
It's 5 years in total.
And we've done 2 years. So we've
fine.
got, a few more years to go.
Right, we've got plenty of time to go. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Tom.
Okay, hi, I'm Tom. I farm on the edge of Exmoor. We farm sort of 550, 540 hectares. We're LFA. We range from 800 feet to 1,200 feet above sea level. We have approximately 1.5 meters to 2 meters of rainfall. This year it feels like 10. And we farm stabilizer cattle. We're running sort of around 900 head. There's 270 cows, but with all the followers, that's the sort of numbers we've got to. And we finish everything off farm, off forage. Majority are gone from 20 to 24 months. We outwinter 270 cattle thereabouts a year. This is what we were doing, not with all of them, but probably half of them was a monoculture of kale. The other half would be on some sort of bale grazing. And just through, I'm a member of Precision Grazing, and just through the bit of chat that was going through the group, somebody flagged up that in New Zealand they were doing a diverse winter mix for grazing in the winter, so we thought we'd have a look at it. We were quite a few of us quite excited. So then James Daniel said that we could have potentially we could do a field lab with an innovative farmers, and with the help of Sarah Whaley from FWAG, we set it up. And initially, what are the problems with what we were doing on the monoculture? We felt soil health wasn't great. The health of the water catchment could be challenged. Low biodiversity, animal health, animal welfare, and farmer welfare were not great, when it's raining. So that was what we felt the problems were. And what we hoped to achieve was to maintain animal health, welfare and performance, extend the winter grazing and produce a second bite, improve soil health, boost biodiversity, eliminate soil erosion, compaction and runoff, sediments and nutrients into waterways, decrease synthetic inputs, reduce costs and use of fossil fuels, and answer the question, can we outwinter without supplementary fodder? So we set up a trial of 4 farmers, each of us planting a 4 hectare area of a 16 species mix, and also a 4 hectare of the monoculture that we were doing, and all of us were doing kale previously. Some of us were strip grazing, some of us are cell grazing. There's 2 organic farms and 2 conventional farms. The cattle were weighed and body condition scored before we started the trial. And the map is that's pretty well Somerset, and that's the blue is the area where the farms were. So we had quite a range from Chris Berry on a rain shadow of Exeter, where very low rainfall, and then me on the top with plenty of rain. So the mix was a mixture of brassica, grass, herbs, legumes, and forbs. What the problems are so what problems were we trying to solve was the forage feed. We needed to maintain forage feed value, winter hardiness, animal health, and improve soil condition, and hopefully build some organic matter. That's the mix, but I'll skip through that fairly quickly. Our learning objectives was determine suitable plant species and varieties for wintering grazing which can achieve desired outcomes, maintain green leaf area and ground cover all year, and provide suitable nutrition for animals, ruminants, and to maintain or increase daily live weight. Soil health outcomes and biodiversity outcomes we wanted to improve. Farm economics we were hoping to reduce. Farmer welfare, and also public perception of what we were doing. So this is the mix at Fortescue Farm growing. And when you've got sunflowers in the field, it's always quite a nice sight. And if you're in the doghouse with the wife, it's very handy when they come to flower. This is actually my mix a bit later on. So this is in August. And as you can see in the map, it was in 22. So that drought year, it was quite challenging getting it established, and then how the different varieties grew. I was absolutely taken over by the tillage radish there. If you can see in the picture, it's really heavily dominant with tillage radish, which went over and lodged, and then the brassicas came through. And this is us actually grazing in mid-November, and that is the diverse mix. So as you can see, it's a lot greener there than almost it was in August. And I don't know whether you can see the soil, but the soil has got a lot more fibre in it. They're not pugging it so much, and that was one of the big takes. And obviously the cows there pushing through the snow to find it, which isn't a problem. This was one of the other farms, and he grew his side by side, which made it quite interesting. So you got your 16 species mix on the left, I think, on your screen with the sunflowers, and the kale on the other side. And then when they came to dig soil pits, this was only 3 months after the diverse mix had gone in. You can see there's quite a difference in soil. This is an identical field side by side. And after 3 months, that was the difference in soil. These figures you can take them as they are, but it depended on the day that they did the bird surveys. So there was definitely more birds where the diverse mix was. And at times you could see massive flocks going around, and then there'd be a sparrowhawk following them around behind, which we wouldn't see normally up with us in the winter. And pollinators was massive with the sunflowers in the summer. That there was a hell of a boost there. So this is us at Lower Brown Farm, and we strip grazed with the intention to put up a back fence, but we had 3 weeks of frost, and once it was frozen, there was bigger issues with water rather than putting up a back fence, and the back fence wasn't going to achieve anything. And we were on twice a day moves. Initially, we started with no bales because I wanted to see how the cows would perform just on the diverse mix. But after a couple of weeks, it was quite apparent that we weren't feeding enough. So we brought bales in. We had 48 head right there for 48 days, and that was 24 cow-calf pairs, effectively. The actual cows lost condition, and I'd put that down to those first 2 weeks when we were underfeeding them. And the calves only did 0.5. This was Richard Stanbury's farm, and he was doing cell grazing effectively. And if you to start with, you can see the cells are quite big, so he was moving once a day, and then he found that with the wet, it was better to go twice a day. He also found he wasn't feeding them enough, so it looks like he's giving almost half as much again, but it's in 2 bites. His stock also didn't do that well. They were only doing, it looks like it's negative 0.2, and that was at 18 head for 60 days. But this is also Richard Stanbury's, which is quite an interesting picture. The bare soil is where the kale was, but the green is where the diverse mix was. So where we did gain was it all greened up again quite quickly, and we all got 1 or 2 more feeds out of it before we turned it back to whatever else we were doing. So the results were put together with by James Daniel, and these are some of the results. They don't run true across the whole. It's not obvious how it's gone. My figures were pretty similar. Some of the other lads, their kale did a lot better than their control, but we were in a hell of a drought. And depending on where you were and when you got it in, it either grew or it didn't. And this is grazing density, duration, and costs. And my costs were fairly similar, which are the first 2 columns, at 76 pence per head per day. This is, there wasn't any labour in that, so that was just the variable costs. Yeah, and the others were fairly similar for me. But then there was a massive variation with some of the others. George's costs were £2.38, but that was because he was more interested in soil because he's more of an arable farm, so he wanted to push through a lot quicker and leave a lot more behind. Whereas I was tending to want to utilise all of it, being a bit tighter really. There's some performance figures, and these are very variable as well. But my calves did do better on the kale than the diverse mix. But that's probably because I was underfeeding those cows at the beginning of the diverse mix. We did have bales in the kale all from the start. So our lessons learned was, we definitely improved soil health. There was better water infiltration. There was an abundance of pollinators and other insects. We fed a large population of birds through the winter. We helped keep the cattle and reduce the pugging, keep the cattle out of the mud and reduce the pugging, and better rumen function and better livestock health. So straight away you could see the cattle were dunging better on the diverse mix. And they didn't seem to need much transitioning. They would go straight in and it wasn't an issue, not like the kale where they can take a little while to transition. I'd say near comparable stock performance, but that's probably a little bit optimistic in the trial itself. But we did have regrowth and an opportunity for further grazings. Just like to thank Innovative Farmers for helping to set it up, and also Fwag and James Daniel, because it was a really interesting trial. Going forward, this was us last year, so we put in a 14 species mix, maize, vetch and clover, sunflowers, millet, triticale and rye, kale, turnips and phacelia. And this is us in it in the 5th of November, so we had a much bigger biomass. It's as tall as the cows there. And this is what we're doing this year. So we've just taken an off-the-peg birdseed mix and added some sorghum, some Japanese millet, some kale, turnip, sunflower, plantain, and Italian ryegrass. And that's at a cost of £150 a hectare, whereas if we put kale in, it would only be £65 a hectare. But I can now claim the birdseed mix payment of £853 a hectare. I can't go into it until the beginning of February, but that's okay because we can work with that. But that's how it's stacking up now. That's me done.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. Yeah. It's really exciting to see how the SFI payment is enabling you to really add a considerable benefit and still getting all those biodiversity benefits, but then you're confident that you can get, the results that you want in terms of cow growth. So that's really great. We've still got some time for questions. So any questions for our three speakers, please? Any questions? Oh, guy over in the black. Could you just hang on for the microphone? Thank you.
Hiya. How did you calculate the bale wastage in that bale grazing? It was around 5 or 10%.
Yeah, that was just based on us asking each of the farmers what their anticipated bale wastage is, and it's probably not too far off, but I'm not aware of anyone who's done an actual measure of how much. But I think estimation's pretty fair, Claire.
Yeah, it was kind of it was an eye judgment, I would say.
Great. Gentleman here.
Hello, Hans from Norway. I'm running some sheep, so I have a question about the kale. Kale is high for the sheep, maybe, or I want to use a forage rape. Have you considered using the new mix, the hybrid with forage rape and kale, coming from New Zealand, from Agricom?
You're directing that at me?
Yeah, to Tom.
No, we haven't got sheep. I have tried rape and rape hybrids. The kale seems to do better for us. We did even put it in the mixes, but the kale seems to be the winner in that it would keep growing through the winter. And if it's 6 foot tall, it doesn't matter. The cows can pull that down and eat it down to 6 inches.
At the back there.
Hello there. Is this on? Yeah. Yeah, so I attempted to outwinter 70 store cattle this last winter, and I deferred grazing on some chalk downland. And they were all travelling quite nicely up until what felt like the 1st of March, when they just started to suddenly melt. And there was still plenty of what I thought grass on the ground. But I was just interested to hear what you said earlier about the quality of the grass just dropping off at the end of February. I almost saw it overnight, and we had to quickly rescue them and get them in and sort of turn them around somehow. But what is it? What actually happens that time of year that when you think you've got grass, it actually turns out that there's nothing good for them in that grass at that time of year?
I also don't know the science behind it, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it happened to us years in a row as well. I do wonder if this year it was particularly warm, and so they weren't shouting at us quite as much. But yeah, I honestly couldn't tell you. I'd have to ask a scientist.
You know, Emily.
Yeah, I'm not sure for certain, but there's certainly, and there's an interesting little piece of work in Ireland done by Chuckus, and it was actually looking at sheep outwintering, all grass wintering of sheep, and they were analysing the pasture as it went through winter, and they noted actually after, as soon as you hit New Year, so into January. Now let's bear in mind their climate's probably slightly different, but the pasture quality was dropping off, and whether it's something to do with I know it was a bit cloudy because I'm from the north where we can get down to 0 growth rates, but whether it's something to do as well just with leaf age. So as leaves are older, and particularly, if you've deferred it for a reasonable amount of time, by the time you're getting in to graze it, that actually it might look fine, but it's just not quite such good quality as to what we view. So I think it's really important if anybody does want to do it, because deferred grazing, we were talking about bale grazing, but deferred grazing, i.e. without providing any of the hay, is by far and away the cheapest and easiest way to outwinter your suckler cattle, your cattle. But if you are doing it, might be worthwhile just tracking. It's not expensive to do a quick analysis on them and just track and see when it does happen, so that you can have your plan B or plan C because it's the last thing you want, particularly with store cattle, is just that drop, just when you think it should be taking off again.
Great.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Just going back to the same question, what was the predominant grassland species in the deferred grazing?
It's quite a big mixture, and it's changed over time as well. We've got there's an awful lot of birdsfoot trefoil. There's a lot of rush. There's millennia. There's grasses. There's multiple different types of grasses. I'm just wondering, look at Sam, if I could. I know that you're in. What's predominant grass? Do you reckon?
Tufted hairgrass.
Yeah, tufted hairgrass. Meadows, foxtail, there's sweet vernal in there. I mean, it is quite a big variety.
Are you meaning, Alex, on the deferred areas where we saw decline in quality, or just generally what people were using?
Deferred areas we see crashing up from the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got fescues in there as well. I mean, it's classed as acid grassland, and it's definitely rough grazing, so it's not our meadows. But yeah, it is quite a big mixture. But it's probably acid grassland species.
Have you been you're doing forage analysis as part of the IF trial?
Yes,
how many times?
So we are doing forage analysis in the bale grazing field, but not in the deferred grazing.
Yes, okay.
But yeah, we're doing it once a year in summers when we're doing forage analysis.
Which
of that
wouldn't
field.
necessarily give us the information we want. Any more questions? Lady at the front, and then the lady in the hat. Oh, we'll just do the lady at the front.
Hi, I overwintered some jerseys in Jersey on a rye and quite a herbal ley. It really, really knocked back the rye this year. I was really surprised at the difference in that pasture compared to pasture which wasn't used for overwintering. Again, it just seemed like a bad thing to do because of that. I wondered if any of you could talk to that.
You're saying rye, as in
Ryegrass, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, yes.
The ryegrass growth has been incredibly slow, and I've had I'm organic. I've had a load of creeping buttercup take over completely.
Not what you want.
No, and the plantain, it was full of plantain before even that's really been knocked back. It's just completely changed it.
Yeah, I would say that your perennial ryegrass probably isn't robust enough, and a diverse, native grasses would cope better.
The lady here, and then we'll finish up.
Hi. We're happenstance smallholders, so I don't know all the correct terminology. But is it possible to cut hay and then overwinter on the same land? Because we've only got 6 hectares. And we've got Sussex cattle, so they get quite a lot out of not a lot.
It wasn't us that did the hay in the same field as the bale grazing, but we cut hay quite late, July. In fact, last year we cut it in September because we didn't have a dry enough period in July and August. I probably wouldn't outwinter on a field that we just cut hay for because we need that whole growing season to get a good amount of thatch on the ground to support, particularly for cows. I don't know if it's different with sheep, but the cows have got a weight behind them, and there's not enough growth between when we're cutting hay and the winter time to kind of support the soil structure.
Great. Well, I think we'll finish up before we all just melt into a big heap. So thank you ever so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our speakers, to Claire and Emily and to Tom. If you do have any trials that you're interested in, clearly these are some very successful examples of people doing outwintering, and bale grazing really is, going from strength to strength in terms of people's experiences. But anything else people would be liking to trial, do come and find us at the Soil Association tent and we'll set up a trial. But thank you very much.